welcome to From Thinking to Inking, Episode 1, Part 3. In this episode, Mrs. Caitlyn Mitchell and I take a deep dive into Shifted. We go through chapter by chapter and discuss what she wrote in enough depth that in an hour we only get through chapter 3. There are a couple of sidetracks, but I did have a script to pull us back, so enjoy the rest of this interview.
All right, so I'm going to get into some more detailed questions here. Why did you create the character of Jared? What did you feel like Lewis needed in his life that
Oh,
he gave?
Jared's fun.
He is a fun
Well,
character.
I figured that Lewis would need a bud. Um, and I just I don't really know that I've read any Beauty and the Beast stories where there is a Jared equivalent. Obviously there are other people living the in the town, and Lewis would have friends and he would have companions, and it felt like he would need a companion. And Jared was also kind of the foil to Lewis, where he's kind of comedic and not really too interested in duty, and Lewis is very kind of a wet blanket type at first, and he's very duty bound, and especially after all the tragedies that befall him, he's very solemn and a bit depressed. And Jared is the rambunctious other character, so he was always meant to set Lewis off a bit. And um uh kind of by accident, uh, Jared actually is the main character in a book I wrote a couple books later. Um, One of the other things that I was doing in my initial first books was I would try to allude to other fairy tales. So there's when Jared and Ava are describing the way they met, that's Cinderella, because she's climbing a tree, she loses her shoe, he's hiding behind a pumpkin watching her, and gives her shoe back, and that's how they meet. And then Jared, um, has all of his ridiculous hobbies, one of which at one point is growing beans. I wrote, later, a Jack and the Beanstalk story about what happened there. And so this is pre-shifted, and that's one my agent is sitting on right now, and that's very Irish mythology when he goes up to where the giants live. Um, and that one was pretty fun, exploring him more fully from a main character's perspective, where Lewis is the side character. So that was pretty fun. But mostly Jared's inception was to provide a foil for Lewis, and to kind of flesh out the character of the town, of the other people who lived there and who Lewis would have known.
So I'm just going to give a brief overview of chapter 12. So that's where we meet Lewis, we meet Jared, find out that Jared doesn't take really anything seriously, and Lewis goes for a horse ride on a new horse that his father's just purchased, I believe. Um,
Yes.
and then they run into Robin on the road. So
hmm
why did you decide to use the horse ride to introduce us to Robin?
Um, well, a couple of things. So yet again, going back to Robin McKinley and Beauty, the horses, or the one horse in that story, Beauty's horse, Greatheart, is very important in that book, um, and kind of serves as you see the human to beast characters, but then you get kind of a deeper understanding of how terrifying this beast character is based on the animals that react to him. And so I thought that was a really profound idea, and I wanted to explore that further in my own book. Also, being a fan of horses myself, and I wanted to give Lewis something more um, athletic than just being a printer, um, to focus his ideas on. So the horses, become important later. And also, I wanted to set the stage early for the horse knows something's wrong, and being able to smell the magic on people. And you've got animals have weird intuitions. You always talk about cats who can see other spectrums, and that's why they stare at the wall. And dogs who can sense cancer cells. That just blows my mind every time. And so using that kind of um, animal intuition to say there's something wrong with this guy. Lewis and Jared kind of sense something, but they brush it off because, oh, magic doesn't really exist, but the animals know. Um, and so that initial ride and meeting Robin kind of sets the horses up as being important later. Um, and I say all this like I knew it at the time. A bunch of the decisions that I at least make as a writer, and I always found this hilarious when I was taking literary analysis classes where we're saying all these things that the writer did and must have been aware of. Half the time I think it's an accident. You go back later and you're like, oh, I was a genius, wasn't I? Or you just get credit for stuff that people say. You really knew what you were doing, and you're like, yeah, sure, okay. So the horses ultimately tied it all together. But initially, it was I wanted, Lewis to, be on horseback, and the horse loses control, and there's Robin, and wouldn't that be creepy? So that was kind of ultimately the way that scene played out, and then it kind of all came together at the end with the horses, also the one horse, Jethro, not Jared, being able to smell the magic on Bree and being afraid of her from a purely predatory standpoint, and being able to use that, overcoming that as a means of breaking down the curse. um,
So I love the way that you described Robin inside that first scene about how it. How did you put it? It was like his face was smiling, but his skin wasn't, or something, which was
mm,
just
mm,
a very unnerving image, and it made it feel it.
yeah.
It made me think of like the bug in Men in Black. Like this was
Oh
not,
gosh, oh gosh. Yes. Oh man, that character makes me laugh. But yes,
but
cringeworthy,
so
very much so.
But so it actually made me. So it really does set off Robin, but it actually had me thinking that it was like not even a fairy type creature, like it was like a demon or something, just wearing human skin essentially that didn't
Mm,
fit right.
right.
So that was
I
a very
wouldn't.
good
I
description.
wouldn't.
I felt.
I wouldn't say that that is a bad analysis of what Robin really is, or any of the Midas or Robin particularly. Eyeless obviously looks human because she is human, but for most of the book, she puts on a shade of age so that she fits in. And I would definitely argue that the mythology, of any fairy realm, but these books in particular, would support that the human guises that they put on are really just a shape. Um, and they can, I mean, Robin shapeshifts later, and I'm sure Midas could too if he wanted to. So yeah, Robin putting on a human shape because that's what he needs, but it doesn't really fit right. I think is a very accurate and apt description. Um, and yeah, I always wanted his laughter to be very kind of present and malicious, but it's like he doesn't really know how to make it look right, because it's not positive. It's and I've met people, obviously not to this degree, but like you can feel like they're laughing at you, but their face is just wrong, and it's a very negative image, and that's what I was trying to paint, especially with Robin, where everything's a joke but at your expense, or very dangerous in its own way. So yeah, the bug, oh my gosh, I love that actor. I can't even think of his name, but he did such an amazing job with that character.
Yeah, he's very good. I saw him in a couple of things. I didn't even recognize him except for his voice. He had a very distinct voice.
Yeah.
It was Daredevil. He played Kingpin, and I was like, man, I don't. This guy does not look familiar at all, but I
Oh
know
gosh, I didn't.
that way of talking.
Oh, you mean the Daredevil TV show?
Yeah, the Netflix one.
Yes. Yeah, I was immediately thinking of the old movie. But yeah, I saw the first
Yeah, no,
season
he's
of
not the black guy.
yeah, yeah. I was very confused at first. But no, yeah, he's pretty terrifying in the TV show. I couldn't watch more than a season because it was so brutal. But very well done, and he's such a diverse actor. I feel like he does get typecast a bit. Um, the way his character in Law and Order, And then, his character in the Jurassic Park or Jurassic World movies were very similar. But then, you look at like the Kingpin character and you're like, oh yeah, he's got some depth there. That I don't I haven't seen a whole bunch of his work, so maybe, he's got a lot of various characters, but I've only seen a couple where he was given a role that took him outside of that Law and Order kind of guy. And I think he's great.
So then we come to the second chapter, chapter 11,
Mhm.
where and inside of this one, so starts off. You meet. This is when you meet Lewis's parents,
Mhm.
and there's like a storm outside, and they have to go. I can't remember where they're going, but they have to go somewhere, and
Yeah, the next town
they're
over, basically.
yeah, and their carriage is like falls down a ravine due to the road giving out,
Hmm.
and then shortly after, and Robin is actually asking uh, Lewis's uncle to reprint some legal documents, which I'm guessing I don't think he ever specified, but I think it's like he's trying to claim ownership of the manor. I think.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, and
absolutely.
that's when he finds out that his parents are dead, and then shortly afterwards, Lewis's uncle dies of a heart attack, and
Yeah.
um, so it's a very busy chapter.
It
Um,
is. It is a very busy chapter.
so
And honestly, I think no, that all happened in one chapter, in the first draft. I don't think that was spread over two chapters, and then got tightened down. I did actually add. I think that whole hospital scene
mm,
got added on in the second draft. If I remember correctly, I could be misremembering, but yeah, it's unfortunately I one of the constraints of trying to keep under a certain word count means that certain chapters have to be, or every chapter's got to be pretty jam packed, and that one in particular, and that's in keeping with the Beauty and the Beast story where everything kind of goes wrong all at once uh, in various ways. Business goes bad, people die, and it really forces the characters out. In some Beauty and the Beast stories, they have to move and they go to this new home. In some it forces them into poverty. In this one, kind of a bit of both, and forces him to be take charge of the family, and that's what starts strangling him, is just trying to keep things going for his aunt, and he loses all of his freedom, and then he loses even more of his freedom in just a brief moment of wanting to get away from a tea party, and that's when he finds the enchanted manor. So yeah, a lot went on there. Um, so
so so why did you decide to make the character of Aunt Myrtle his aunt rather than like his mother?
oh, that kind of falls behind. And I've heard criticisms before of fairy tales for this trope where the parents are always gone. Um, but I do believe that there is something behind having and I've some of my other books, the parents are there and alive and well. I've tried to not always allow this trope to be a thing, but in a story like this where you're supposed to have lost essentially everything, you have such a sense of comfort. Most people, I mean, obviously, if you've got a stable relationship with your parents, you've got such a sense of home and an innate belonging with your parents that I've heard it said before with the building of fairy tales and stories of this nature. If you have a place to go back to, you will. And so having an aunt who's kind of as close to a mother as he can have anymore, but also somebody he's in charge. He's taken care of her now. She's a widow. She doesn't have any means of income beyond what can be given to her by the church. They've got kind of a bizarre, even relationship now that wouldn't be the same if it was his mother, because your mom was your mom. Um, but your aunt, not only does she have kind of a sideways uh, familial relationship to him, but that level of I'm responsible for her well-being is more heightened than it would have been if it was his mother. So not only kind of giving credence to the old, fairy tale of losing parents and then being forced into the world, but also just I felt like it helped the state of independence and also desperation that Lewis needed to get to, for the one remaining familial tie that he had, not being a parent of some kind. Um, yeah.
So another thing that I noticed in that chapter is, why did you have, and you may not even remember doing this, but because it's just like a line, but why did you have Aunt Myrtle notice that there was something off about the storm the last couple of days? She says something about like the color of the sky is like it's ominous
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah, it's she's a very I wanted Aunt Myrtle to be a very sharp cookie. She's not just some lady who's obsessed with tea parties. She's smart. And she's also very perceptive. Uh and since, she's sticking around, um I didn't want to, as it were, draw too much attention to Lewis's parents, because they weren't going to stick around very long. And you don't really want to build up a character too much who's all of a sudden gone. Um, so to have somebody notice the storm, it could have been Lewis. And I think in the first draft it might have been him. But I also wanted to give Myrtle more presence in that scene, not only as a foreshadowing to something's going to go wrong, but also gives her more solidity in the book in general. And maybe it was, I don't know that I consciously did this at the time, but looking back on it now, she's also the one who, first really speaks the fact that Lewis is in love aloud. At the very end, when he's taking care of her and she's getting better, and she's like, "You're in love, aren't you?" And Ilis has kind of been thinking that might be the case. Lewis is starting to come around to it, but Myrtle is the first one who's really like, "Dude, you love this girl, go." And so, her perception is kind of overall, um, semi always present. But in I don't know that there was necessarily any deep thought behind, her being the one who noticed. She was, a person present in the room at the time, and I had her or Lewis to choose between, and I picked her. Um, so yeah, I think that's the best answer I could give to that one.
Uh, so Lewis is with his uncle in the print shop, who he's
Hmm.
apprenticed to, when he finds out about his parents dying. But when he goes in, Robin is in there, and you get this really stylized description that almost sounds like a Jack the Ripper scenario of like he's standing over and there's like demon fire everywhere, and he sees his uncle lying dead in front of Robin, and all that, and then like he blinks and it goes away. It's just like a premonition kind of thing. What were you
Hmm.
trying to do with that? Like, why did you include that?
Well, that was kind of a holdover from. It was a scene I wanted to keep, but initially it was more ominous, in the first draft, where Robin was, to blame for all of the terrible things that happened, and that was him setting up this curse that's about to befall everybody. Um, but in the rewrite, where it's not his fault, he's legitimately just there, to pay his respects to his lady love, who had died, a century, 2 centuries past, and getting some, he's got these old, deeds, which are really more of a joke. He's laughing at Lewis at this point. um, but or really more, he's laughing at Ilis, because Lewis hasn't really gotten involved yet. But yet again, that scene where Lewis is seeing something that's not actually there is a premonition, as you said. It's uh, a momentary glimpse into, the world of other. Um, kind of like with the horse ride where the horse notices something. And I actually, it's interesting. I did not intend for his uncle to appear dead in that scene. It was always just a matter of when I wrote it, and the way I read it, but I'd have to go back and look at it again and see um, uh, what the writing there was. He's more being held kind of entranced by Robin, and that premonition is yeah. It's if it comes across that he's actually dead, that's way heavier than I realized. Um, but yeah, it's basically just an insight into Robin's uh, more sinister, less human side. And I've always loved, when you um, reading books and stories where you have these fairy characters and there are little hints, little seen out of the corner of your eye, moments of magic that can be really beautiful or really um, kind of scary. And this is one of those scary moments where the light on the buttons of his coat makes them look like eyes, and um, he's already suspicious for no reason of this guy who's kind of rubbing him the wrong way, and this is just another moment of that. So I'll have to go back and look at that scene and read it with the description that you gave, because that's definitely uh, uh, pretty intense. And I think Robin is in general supports it. I just didn't realize it was that that wild in that scene.
Broader question here. So,
Hmm.
why did you decide to start the book where you did, rather than picking up, having it start, say, after chapter 11, when um, Lewis is already an orphan and living with his aunt and trying to make ends meet? Why did you want to show how everything went to crap?
That's just a matter of preference. My favorite Beauty and the Beast stories have always included that part. And I've always felt any Beauty and the Beast story where they kind of start in the middle of things. It feels like in the middle of things to me. And yet again, going back to my favorite one, the one by Robin McKinley, that one starts where everything is good and prosperous, and then bad things happen, and they're forced to leave and sell everything they own, and go to another town where they meet this beast character, and the curse is triggered, as it were. So that was just really, I like stories that start there with this fairy tale. And it also gave me an opportunity to, introduce the characters when things are good, and show their descent into what's when their struggles. And it also gave me an opportunity to introduce um, Eyeless and Robin and some of the other characters at the beginning. And initially, when I wrote that portion of it with Robin um, causing all of this mischief on the town, it was integral to his character development. Um, and I Even when it became kind of more um, traditional with the this is just uh, bad things happening to good people and less a magical avenue of it. I still felt like it really set the stage for going into this other world. So yeah, just a personal preference there of the storytelling.
All right. So then we go into chapter 10, which is a slower chapter, especially compared to the last one. Uh, we see Lewis is tea partying against his will,
Hmm.
and he's it's about him trying to pick his life back up and get and
Right.
attain a new normal. Um,
Yeah.
so there's a lot
Stifling.
more.
So,
Say it again.
and yeah, it's a stifling normal. So the speed change there
Yeah.
very much kind of fulfills it mimics what's happening in the books. And hopefully it's not too uh, jarring for the reader. You never want the choices you make to be distracting. But yeah, it is supposed to be, kind of feel like, going down a hill on three wheels, and then, uh, oh, it's a tea party and ties, and why in the world is he, his whole life just fell apart. Why in the world is he doing this? And that's how he's feeling at the time as well. Just trying to stay above water, and he feels like he's slowly drowning. So yeah.
So more to your process. Your This book is pretty minimalistic inside of its descriptions. You're very
Hmm.
choosy, so there's a lot more descriptions of things like clothing in this chapter. So when do you decide that someone's outfit is worth describing?
Ooh, that's a good question. I I don't know. I think it's less a matter of I decide when a character's outfit is worth describing, and more uh when so I guess this kind of has to do with my growth as a writer over the years. I used to describe everything in my first short stories, my first novel. Everybody's eye color and hair color and exactly how they looked got described, and that ultimately, the writing that I like the most and the writing that I respect the most um, gives you just, and I find Tolkien's writing and Lord of the Rings to be very much this way, gives you just enough to build the story, but you really need to use your imagination. And I know Tolkien does this to a much greater degree than I do. I think you really need to envision and world build in your head when you're reading Lord of the Rings, and I think that's why some people struggle, and it feels like such a hard read because you're working.
Yeah, and one
But
of the things that I think shows that it was worth it for him is the fact that when the movies came out and you saw the models and everything, there was nobody that said that's not how I pictured that looking. Like every
yeah,
single thing was like, yeah, that's exactly the image that popped in my head.
yeah,
And
yeah,
everyone had the same one.
yeah, and he was so good at it. Just amazing.
Very poetic in his way.
So my initial writing was very the opposite of that. And as I honed my craft, as it were, in classes and short stories and other things, I learned to kind of pull it back. And I love color. I think that comes from my painting, and the color of things is very important to me. I've got a little bit of synesthesia with words. Different words have different colors. Um, but I try to avoid describing people, the way they look, unless it's really important. Because I fall into the habit of their eyes were green, their hair was black, and in this chapter, the clothing is very much about the kind of strangled glamour that Lewis is struggling with. He doesn't have the money for fancy suits. He's being forced to engage with these women who might as well be propped up dresses for him, for as much attention as he's giving them. He's paying more attention to the color of their skirt than their face. And I imagine, whenever I've talked to my husband, I'm always like, do you notice any of these things that women obsess over, and we think that guys notice, and half the time, no, it doesn't matter. I'm what color dress, whether you're wearing jewelry or whatever, half the time it's more important to the women than it is to the men. And obviously that's a generalization. I'm speaking from very narrow examples, but
It's a pretty
I,
effective generalization.
okay, okay, good. But I kind of wanted to, have this be like the exact opposite. He's paying attention to things that he usually wouldn't be, mostly as he's just distracted. He's trying to avoid these women, and they've kind of become just mannequins to him. He calls them the women. They're lace and doilies and everything that he doesn't care about. He cares about good conversation, and he cares about um people who like books, and really these women have become frilly props that his aunt is trying to get him to like. um So I think that's where the concentration on the clothing comes into play here. Uh, it's also you know, meant to be the yeah. I guess I just be reiterating all that I just said. Frilly things that ultimately have no meaning have become his world, and he wants
Yeah,
to just get away from it all.
a really good answer. Um,
Oh, good.
so on that same note, you had him go over to Ilas's house in this
Mhm.
chapter, and you went into a lot of detail about how they were picking strawberries, like describing exactly what they were doing. I'm just curious why
Oh, I don't even know. Just a joy of describing gardening, being, kind of uh, a, a contrast to the tea party where you're sitting there surrounded by silk and lace, and all of a sudden you're in the dirt, and that feeling of putting your hands in freshly turned dirt, and it's cold, and I really want Eyeless to be the exact opposite of all these things that Lewis is struggling with right now, with being indoors, being strangled by his tie, and she is a haven. She's fresh fruits and vegetables, and nobody cares that she's barefoot and her hair is flying into her tea, and she is the exact opposite of this prim and proper world that his aunt is desperately trying to get him to be a part of. And so that was also just like giving into my delight in describing those types of things. Anytime I have a story where uh, you get towards nature and the woods, I have to be very careful not to go overboard with those descriptions. And sometimes I'm more successful than others. So hopefully that wasn't too uh, cumbersome, but that's kind of the exact opposite of where he just was, or where he's going. In that case, he's going to his doom to this tea party and trying to get in a little bit of dirt and sweat. And he also used to work on a horse farm. He knows labor, and he knows you know grime, and wearing grimy clothes that you don't really care if they get smeared in all kinds of bizarre contents. um, and that's where he feels comfortable, not uh, all propped up and fancy. And so uh, describing him being a bit more comfortable there, I think, puts into contrast when he gets to the tea party, or when he's at the tea party, and it's like, oh golly, I'm gonna break this teacup off, by holding it wrong, or um, and being completely unaware of how much the young ladies do enjoy his company, because he's so caught up in his own misery of how out of he feels.
He also he looks at, I believe it's his uncle's old chair in the office, and you go through a very nostalgic description. Why did you pick the chair for that?
Um, Gee, I don't know.
That's an acceptable answer.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what about in my mind's eye that was the most visible thing in the office. And it's I feel like any office person, any writer, there's something about your workspace that's really important, no matter how many iterations it takes. And um, for me, my chair is important. It's gotta be big enough that I can cross my legs, or sit in all kinds of weird, quirky positions, because I love to make my feet fall asleep. That's a good thing. But it's gotta have arms that I can rest my elbows against, and for me, the chair is important. So I guess that was kind of getting put on that scene as well, where the chair is where it happens. um, and in this regard, it's where the work happens, and it's the one place in that office that still feels like his uncle, and also his. um, so yeah, I guess that's why that took some focus.
You also brought up this is the only time that we get a mention of Lewis's old dog, and he starts
Yeah.
being nostalgic for simpler times. Why did you choose to flash back to a dog rather than like a memory with his dad or something? So,
I don't know. I mean, one could argue that that's kind of a wild herring, and probably could have been more appropriate to be a memory of his dad. I it might have just been I never had a dog as a kid, and I always wanted one, and I still want a dog someday. I talk about it all the time, and go gaga over any dog I see on the street, whether it's a puppy or not. So I think that was probably just my longing there for a memory I don't have. Yeah, and any ratty chair you can imagine pretty distinctly, how did the gashes and the fluff get taken out, and a chewing puppy is a pretty good and understandable example there. And yeah, so maybe just nostalgia, that missing nostalgia of my own.
dogs are pretty great.
They're amazing. They're too
You're
good
right
for
to want
this. I want like I and part of that is also, Ilis has her whole pack of wolfhounds.
one. Mm.
That's totally, if I had the space and the money for it, oh boy. When I'm the house we rent right now, we're not allowed to have animals, which is why we don't, but um once we live in a place where we're allowed to have dogs, I think it's going to be a pretty quick downhill spiral into a pack
You're gonna be
of
the crazy
of
dog lady.
critters. Oh yeah, oh yeah, it's going to be great.
Um, so also in this chapter, Jared has a conversation. Lewis has a conversation with Jared about how he intends to never get married, essentially. Um,
Hmm.
so why did you want that conversation to happen? Not even here, but just why did you want it in the book?
It's and to clarify your question, Jared saying he's never going to get married, or Lewis saying
Yeah,
he's never
yeah,
going to get
Jared.
married? Yeah, part of that is just character building for Jared. He is such an all or nothing guy, and he thinks he knows his mind, when really he doesn't. Um, and it sets up quite hilariously later. He is the first one of the two of them to get married and have a kid. Um, when you'd think he's the least likely bachelor ever, because he's so convinced that he knows his mind, and I'm never getting married because that would be a silly thing to do. So there was a bit of irony there, and he's trying to get Lewis to stand up for himself. You hate going to these tea parties. Why do you keep agreeing? Be like me. I know what I'm doing. Um, so a bit of character building there, a bit of foreshadowing, and ultimately, Ava, Jared's um, uh, eventual wife, becomes very important. With her relationship to the both of them, and also, the way she comes after Lewis in a way that nobody else was able to. So yeah, just character building, foreshadowing. I find Jared very funny. He's close to my heart in many ways. So
So this is also the chapter when we meet Eva.
hmm.
Could go either way. And so at this point, I didn't know what the plot was going to be about.
Hmm.
Uh, so and I had this very so there's a lot of people that when they study stories for a long time, they get it becomes less fun for them to watch anything that's remotely cliched because they can
Hmm.
immediately figure out what's going on. I had this unique
Right.
ability to turn off my brain. I don't try to figure out a plot at all. Um, I find I have more fun reading that way. But
Yeah.
so when you introduced Ava, first of all, I could tell that you really like the character of Ava,
Hmm.
and because you actually the description that you give of her, even of her clothes, it's a lot more upbeat and positive from the very beginning and I actually thought that he was going to end up with her when she was
Ah.
like first paragraph, just because you the way that you described her was a lot more positive. Was that intentional, or was it just? Do you think it was just an outgrowth of the fact that you liked her a lot?
I did intend her to be more memorable and more positive. She's definitely a contrast to the other women who are kind of more flippant and call Lewis by his dreaded nickname Lou, and are not the type of women he really understands. Ava was always supposed to be, uh, you know, she's a lover of books. She climbs trees. She's the tomboy of the town, as it were. And part of that is also how she ends up with Jared. Um, but yeah, she was never meant to be a love interest for Lewis, but definitely a good friend. If Lewis is going to be able to make a meaningful friendship with one of the women of marriable age in the town, it was going to have to be someone like her, who had no intentions on him herself, and kind of had more interests aligned with him. Books and uh, uh, not clothes and dolls and all the things that um, uh, uh, kind of your typical girly girl might like. Um, and she's also a fellow hater of the tea parties, so they had that in common, and that's how she was able to say, hey, go over to this manor. There's a place you can get out of town for a little while, because she'd done it many times herself. And Jared would never have been able to give that advice to Lewis because he doesn't ever bother going, and he doesn't need an excuse. He's just not going to do it. But Ava has that societal pressure from her mother, her sisters, her aunt, whoever she lists at that time. So she's kind of forced to go, but she's in the same boat as Lewis, where this is not her scene, this is not her party. And so they kind of bond immediately over that, and form a lasting friendship based on
Yep. And she's a lot of fun.
that. I like
So
her. I also have a lot of sympathies with her as a character. So
so she basically sends him off to his doom.
yeah.
And
Oops.
Lewis doesn't listen to her. He doesn't go into the shack. Instead, he goes into the actual house.
Hmm.
Um, and so when he first walks in, you actually like the description of the entry hall and even the door when he gets to it is you give you give more detail to just those things than you have really anything else in the book at this point. Um,
Hmm.
what why did you decide that you needed to be so descriptive about the manor?
I just had a very visual idea of what it looked like, both in its decay and then also later in its elegance when Bree is manipulating it. And I wanted it to seem like a living thing. The decay of it kind of mimics Bree's beast-like uh, 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 deconstruction. At the same time, they kind of they get run down together and they get made up together, and when she's putting on the glamours of the house and then on herself, it's all just it's all a different kind of shade. And I don't know that I ever um really consciously decide I'm going to describe this a lot, I'm not going to describe this very much. The things that I see the most clearly, or the things that I think are well, I guess I do make a decision of what's relevant and what's not, but I don't know that it's got any um, deeper meaning behind. I think the house is important. I want people to see it. I want people to see what Bree looks like. I want people to see um, the contrast between Eyeless and Robin, and other smaller things like the farmhouse, which doesn't stick around very long, or Aunt Myrtle's apartment. Not really important. We don't spend much time there. Any place where we spend a lot of time, I want to describe because I want readers to be able to build that place around them, and feel like they're sitting there or walking there themselves. So the house got a lot more description. Also because it was very, Lewis has never been here before. This is a new experience for him. So he's noticing things that you don't necessarily notice when you walk into a room you've been in 1,300 times. Um, it's kind of like how everybody else's house has a smell, but you don't notice the smell of your own home because obviously you live there. But other people come into your home and they're like, oh, your house, I have a very, very, very strong memory of how like my grandmother's house smells, but she would never smell it because she lives there. So that kind of imagination goes into it. Anytime there's a place that's brand new for the characters, or brand new for the readers, that isn't necessarily like a place where they've been living, that's probably going to get more description than otherwise. Part of that's conscious, part of that's subconscious, part of that's it's fun to describe. Um, so I think all of that kind of mixes together to produce those moments of heavier description.
Yeah. Um, so one thing you managed to do that I just thought was really cool is how actually. So at first it's just like this dark old rundown house that may fall down on top of him. Who knows? He goes inside
Mhm.
and it's just shadowy, and it's an abandoned house that it's something that you know you explore when you're 12 years old. Like nobody ever thinks
Mhm.
anything of it being weird, but as soon as he lights the lantern, it actually gets creepier when it's lit.
Mhm.
And I just thought that was a really cool thing that he managed to pull off. Um,
Awesome.
so in this chapter, was it difficult uh, writing a whole chapter, or going through a whole chapter where one of the two lead characters in it doesn't have a name? Was that something that you had to um, think about a lot as you were working through it? Of how do I keep referring to her in creative ways, so I don't just keep saying
Yeah.
she all over and over again?
Yeah, I think it was less difficult avoiding like she, and more difficult finding a way not to say the girl, the girl, the girl, the
Mm-hmm.
girl, over and over and over again. Because I think we interact with people who we don't necessarily know their names all the time, and sometimes we have extended interactions with them. I mean, I for one am really bad with names, so if I'm ever in a networking situation, someone will introduce me, I'm not going to remember it, or I might not, and they're just kind of that person at the back of my brain for the rest of the evening, or what have you. And I'm not subconsciously going, that guy, that woman, they're just kind of there, and they are themselves even though I don't know what to call them. um so it was technically difficult, I think, just to find ways to refer to her without repeating the same descriptor over and over again. But from a um, Lewis's perspective, I didn't struggle with it in that way. So mostly it was a technical challenge just from a sentence structure way, I suppose, finding ways to rework the sentences without necessarily referring to a placeholder and a verb where her name was. Um, so yeah, it was a challenge in that way, and I struggle with repetition as it is. It seems to morph with every book. Um, the word I'm struggling with right now in my revisions that I have to keep going back and making sure I didn't use it 4 times in 10 pages is expression. The expression on her face, or gave him a sour expression. I keep using expression over and over again. And I call those personal cliches. Um, I think every writer has a series of them that they go to. Some of my favorite authors definitely have them, and I notice them, when I'm reading. And I have my fair share, and I try to avoid them as best I can. But having my beta readers who know what they are and help point them out to me is very important. Um, and so repetition, I tend to be pretty keen on, and so that chapter was high in my mind of trying to make sure I didn't do just that.
Yeah. All right. So he goes into the house and lights the lantern, and he sees her. And so at first you're just like, oh, this house is haunted. Like you get that impression really quickly.
Hmm.
And she's some kind of a ghost. And Lewis, being a pragmatic man, doesn't come to that conclusion, but the reader does. We're just like, oh, you're in
Hmm.
denial. And
Good, that was exactly what I was going for.
but then the chapter takes a really weird turn and just gets incredibly trippy.
Hmm.
So what were you trying to do with basically giving us an acid trip chapter of
Oh
all the
man.
strange stuff that's going on inside of this place?
Um, Part of that was just like my the way I love to see magic portrayed. It's very colorful, it's very visceral, and I've always loved the kind of shape shifting aspects that this cursed house has. And uh, the the changes that I wanted her to have some control over it. And it's something she's learned. She when she first was imprisoned there, she barely knew how to walk or speak, but she has learned how to control her surroundings. And I think it is what's the what's the best way to describe this? Um, if somebody is describing something to you that they're very familiar with or showing you something that they're very familiar with, oftentimes you get left behind real fast, because they're making assumptions that they don't realize are brand new to you. So there was that aspect of, just being in a complete whirlwind of color and light, and she's trying to figure him out. She's trying to figure out what he wants, while also being really scared of him. It's why she kind of goes between this hoarfrost old witch woman and her regular self, which is very not really intimidating, just this mousy girl who happens to have really creepy eyes. Um, and then she's like, oh, maybe he needs to talk to someone beautiful, I'll become beautiful, and that doesn't work. Um, and the house is very almost sentient. It moves, it shifts on its own. The title kind of references everything that happens to Bree and the house. Everything's constantly being shifted, everything's constantly moving, being affected by this curse, by the perceptions that people have about it. So I definitely wanted everything about this house to just put Lewis completely off guard. And his understanding of the world gets broken in one night. Everything he thought he knew completely gone, and that's going to be a very disorienting experience anyway. So everything he's experiencing in this house is kind of um, exponential if he already believed in magic. Because to him, this isn't possible. What I am seeing right now is not possible, and yet there it is. So either you've gone completely cracked and loopy, or you have to admit there's stuff beyond your realm of experience. So it was all that, and magic. Whenever I write magic, it's almost always very colorful. Like I said, I really love describing uh, uh, the color of magic. Actually, I think that's a Terry Pratchett book.
Yes, that's the first
That
one.
title right there. But a lot of the scenes that I write that involve a lot of spells have this kind of quality to them, because it's so not what what we know the world to be. If this was real, I imagine it would be um very like like a thunderstorm, or like a whirlwind, or your senses just completely firing on all cylinders. Um, so part of that goes into Lewis's perception of what's going on and his inability to understand or even believe what he's seeing, and part of that also is just the way I describe magic in many of my books.
So was it always your intention to have the house be like that, like from the initial planning phase, or did you kind of get to this chapter and it was a wouldn't it be cool if?
Oh, I always knew the house was going to be very manipulatable, whether that's by Bree or by Robin. When he puts Bree and Lewis in the house together, he alters the rules again. But no, I always wanted the house to be very wayward, with the rooms moving and with the way things look changing, and Bree having a certain amount of control over it. Um, so that was something that was kind of very set in my mind at the very beginning.
All right. So this is in terms of the story, this is a pretty big chapter. This is the inciting incident. This is also the first time that Lewis meets Bree.
Mhm.
Um, and so I still didn't quite pick up on the Beauty and the Beast at this point, but the the rose thing, I thought it was just a reference to Beauty and the Beast, because
Mm,
that's how it starts. It's,
interesting.
you know, father takes a rose, yada yada yada.
Yeah.
And again, though, like I turn my brain off doing stories. I don't like to try to figure stuff out. The one time I actually tried was The Prestige, because it like challenges you to it
Oh
in the
no.
beginning,
Yeah.
and that didn't go well.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that movie. I did not like that movie at all. But I have having a twin. Anytime there's a movie that has twins and something happens to one of them, I'm just like, nope, no, I will never forgive you. I still haven't forgiven J.K. Rowling. So, yeah, no, that movie freaked me out.
That one, that I actually think that one's really good for me. I think it's one of the greatest examples of like plot twists, because
Mm-hmm.
the ending happens and you're just like, what? None of that makes sense. What
Yeah.
happened? But then
Yeah.
if you watch it a second
Absolutely.
time, you spend like the entire movie smacking yourself in the head, just going, "Oh my gosh, I am an idiot!
Yeah.
How did I not
Yeah.
figure this out?"
Yeah, it's very well constructed in that regard. Yeah, it only creeped me out on a personal factor, but yeah, very well done. Uh, still gives me the heebie-jeebies to think about it though.
But so really important chapter. It's also when he first meets Bree, though we don't have her name yet. So what were your goals as a writer? What did you want established between the two of them inside of this first meeting?
I wanted to give both Lewis and the readers a very, very strong image of Bree. Even though we don't have a name yet, we don't know a whole lot of her history. I wanted people to see where she lives and the weirdness of her world, and what a bleak existence she has. I wanted people to know, uh, basically to get a really good image of this hostile yet lonely and desperate girl, um, who has lived for centuries alone and distrusts anybody who might come through the door, and yet is craving rescue. And so she's really conflicted by Lewis's presence, and Lewis, being very confused by this new experience that he has, is nevertheless, a real a gentleman, and he's really entranced by her. And I'm setting up, the love story that's going to happen. They both are kind of leaning towards each other, even though they don't really know why yet. And he's got this urge to get her out. He's like, this isn't right. We can fix this. And so that's why he initially thinks, let's just go out the front door. And it shows his lack of understanding of magic, and how he's still really not really believing what's going on, because he thinks it's as simple as going out the door when she's told him it's not possible. And I wanted to set the stage for this mystery that's starting to grow. And in most I would argue in all Beauty and the Beast stories, that I'm aware of, when the beauty character enters the house for the first time, that's when they're there. They don't leave again until the very end. Um, and I kind of wanted to build this more slowly. Obviously, there is a point at which Lewis enters the home, and he kind of falls back into the regular fairy tale where you're not going to leave until he discovers the mirror, and then someone's ill and he goes, and that's kind of where that regular storyline picks up. Um, but this initial meeting, it's almost like an accident in the fairy tale. He was never meant to go there in the first place, and all of a sudden he knows magic is there. He knows something about this curse, and he can't get it out of his head. Um, And so that's kind of a change I brought to the fairy tale, where instead of I'm going to kill your father if you don't come send your youngest daughter to live with me, he chooses to go and pursue her and try to figure out what's going on, and break this spell, because he's starting already to fall in love with her and want to set things right. Um, so this is all the setup to their growing relationship. And so that was a liberty I took with the fairy tale myself. um, was kind of stretching it out a little bit there.
I hope you enjoyed this first deep dive into Caitlyn Mitchell's book, Shifted. Next episode, we will continue in the same vein, and I hope you'll join us for that. If you want to support Miss Mitchell and her storytelling, it's as simple as purchasing her books. Shifted and The Roaring Boys are both available on Amazon right now. If you'd like to support this podcast, please subscribe to it on your preferred podcast deliverer, rate it, and share it with your friends. You can also become a patron on patreon.com/thinkingtoinking. If you're a writer of a published or self-published book or viewable film or play who would like to appear in this podcast, you can email me at thinktoinkpodcast@gmail.com. thinktoinkpodcast@gmail.com. From Thinking to Inking is a bookworm podcast recording Kid Entertainment. Theme music is an original composition by and property of Hannah Ausband Scheidt. She may be contacted at hannahosbandscheidt.com, HANNAHAUSBANDSCHEIDT.com.